Colombo, Sri Lanka, the 6th of April 2022. A woman has been waiting for days in a queue for fuel that stretches several kilometers ahead of her. Her back aches as she shifts in her motorcycle seat. Her stomach growls with hunger. She squeezes the tears from her eyes as an angry lump forms in her throat and she thinks, how did we get here? Miles away on an Australian airport tarmac, at the window seat of a plane bound for Sri Lanka, is a man deep in similar thought. He barely registers the cabin crew's safety messages or chinks of glasses or even the sound of the engines as they rev up to take off. He closes his eyes. He is about to head into the biggest challenge of his life. His name is Nandalal Veerasinghe, and he has just been made the governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. This is the final episode of the story of Sri Lanka's economic history, a drama in 5 parts. If you have stayed with us so far, we know why you are here, to find out why this story ended so dramatically. But let's recap briefly of what we've learned so far. We learned that ancient Sri Lanka traded agricultural products with India, Arabia, East Asia and Europe. And because of her access to India, colonial powers wanted to control its resources and profit from their trade. We learned about how these colonizers diverted tax revenues which kings had levied and even added their own. We saw the rise of influential wealthy landowners who stayed close to kings and later governments to establish enterprises of their own. We also saw the emergence of trade unions, how they shaped the island's labor laws and even its politics. We learned how a new kind of political power emerged in response to elitism and dependence on the West to forge better ties with China and Russia. We saw how vulnerable Sri Lanka's tiny import-dependent economy became to sudden shocks when it was closed to all trade in the 70s. Then we saw how economic development from the late 1970s to the early 90s coincided with the most violent period of its history. Financing an ever-escalating war had pushed the government to go to the IMF for support, and then a glimmer of hope, a ceasefire, then a coup, a resumption of the civil conflict, followed by the 2004 tsunami, then a new president. Where we left Sri Lanka, it had its back against the economic wall. We will now tell you why Sri Lanka's economy went into such a deep crisis in 2022. It happened in 4 parts. Here we go. In 2005, when Mahinda Rajapaksa is elected president, the party has a very thin majority in parliament, just 105 seats out of 225. It is also in the middle of an IMF-supported austerity program to cut government spending, which meant belts were being tightened, even though the president's UPFA coalition partners, the JVP, wanted more spending by the government, not less. But there were a few problems. First, 2005 Sri Lanka was recovering from the shock of a devastating tsunami. Second, global oil prices went through the roof, reaching over $100 a barrel. And third, the country was still at war. But running a razor-thin majority, money would have to be spent. But how? Rajapaksa campaigned on the Mahinda Chintanaya, or his worldview. Even though his economic strategy said he called for market orientation, what actually happened was the state becoming a much bigger player in the economy. And of course, import substitution. If you watched our previous episodes, you know what this means. To get businesses to produce goods locally rather than importing them, they would be well shielded from foreign competition through tariffs and quotas. There was also an intent to move to process and refine products in Sri Lanka, known as value addition, rather than exporting them in raw forms. There were promises to upgrade logistics, transportation and energy infrastructure, which was starting to become a bottleneck for growth. And finally, he called for Sri Lanka to be agriculturally self-sufficient rather than importing food. Many point to economic growth in the second half decade of the 2000s as a sign that Sri Lanka was on the right track. Indeed, the economy continued to grow through 2008 at 6.5%, but what started unfolding would pave the way for Sri Lanka's eventual crash, and there were 3 unstable building blocks. Building block number 1. The government's recurrent spending, meaning the funds it needed to maintain essential public services like health and education, was constantly overrunning targets. And then they started building the promised infrastructure, aggressively, targeting 35% of GDP on new investments alone. In 2007, public investment was 229 billion rupees. By 2009, it had swelled to 390 billion rupees. Some of the projects proposed and eventually financed during this period were the Norachile power plant, the Hambantota port, and the Katunayaka expressway. But there was a fundamental problem in financing this expansion. Until Sri Lanka remained a low-income country, they had access to what was called concessionary loans, meaning low interest rates and generous repayment periods. But it was moving towards a middle-income country, and very quickly they would no longer have access to this cheap finance. So how were these projects being funded? Well, it was in three ways. First, they increased borrowing right here at home. Second, some projects were partially funded by development partners. Japanese and Chinese state agencies would lend bilaterally and sometimes finance up to 85% of the project cost, like the Hambantota port. This was not free money. It was still debt, and the government needed to make up the shortfall. Third was a bold move. They also turned to international markets to find new sources of funding. In 2007, the Sri Lankan government issued their very first US dollar sovereign bond for $500 million to speed up infrastructure building and bridge any gaps. During this period, the governor of the central bank was Ajit Niwad Cabral. The sovereign bond was a very different animal, and nothing like the kind of debt Sri Lanka had been used to servicing. Interest rates were high, there was no grace period, interest was biannual, and the total had to be repaid in 5 short years. If successful, the government would be able to benchmark an international price for its debt and be able to access even more capital. But there was also the risk. Would we be able to earn enough from these projects to repay? The risk was weighed against potential future earnings from projects which the bond was meant to finance, and it was in fact very successful when it debuted internationally. By 2010, Sri Lanka was on its third international sovereign bond, and this would keep going well into the next government. In fact, between 2007 and 2019, Sri Lanka issued $17 billion worth of sovereign bonds. But now, the government has a new problem on its hands. All this debt, and particularly debt which needed to be repaid quickly, had driven up its short-term expenses. What was the outcome? While the economy grew overall, once the northern part of the country was reopened for business, total government debt, which was 2.2 trillion rupees in 2005, rose to 4.5 trillion by 2010. In the same period, the amount of annual debt servicing, meaning annual interest payments and any repayments of loans, went from 300 million rupees to over 820 million rupees. Which brings us to the second wobbly block. Was all this investment going to increase earnings for Sri Lanka? Many may have thought so, but others wondered, how would our earnings go up to repay all this? The investments, which many reasoned were necessary, were in underlying infrastructure. This is different from what economists would call tradable sectors, which is actual capacity for making goods and services that could be traded globally. In fact, by 2015, the manufacturing part of the economy shrunk from 39% to 20% within just 15 years. So, Sri Lanka was piling up its debt to grow its economy, which by 2009 had doubled in size to over $42 billion. It had done this by investing in infrastructure, but didn't have much of a plan of how it would earn enough to repay this debt. Also during these years, several economists pointed out that no matter what efforts were made, Sri Lanka still imported much of what it needed to either consume or refine and export. In times of high growth, import-dependent nations will run up a large import bill, causing the economy to overheat. In fact, the economy did show signs of overheating as early as 2007, and inflation reached nearly 20% by the middle of that year. But without increasing earnings through exports to balance the import-export equation, the situation could not last for too long. Politically, President Rajapaksa needed to show up more support. He did this in two ways. First, he appointed his own family members to key ministries. Second, he expanded the ministerial cabinet to the largest in world history, adding to the ranks whenever there was the possibility of a defector from the opposition attracted by ministerial portfolio. And of course, under pressure from its allies in the ruling party, the government was still subsidizing fuel for its citizens and running inefficient state-owned enterprises which were politically difficult to reform. Sri Lanka also just wasn't an attractive enough destination. With a slow public sector, weak rule of law, an inflexible labor market, and an education sector that had lagged behind the world, there was not much to tempt foreign investors. After 4 years of climbing steadily, foreign direct investment in Sri Lanka plunged from a high of $750 million to $400 million in 2009. And of course, the country was still fighting a major war, which had been stepped up significantly since the LTTE blockaded a major eastern waterway in July 2006. This had given President Rajapaksa an impetus to redirect and integrate several resources to escalate military offensives on humanitarian grounds. Then, in February 2009, anticipating the challenges that lay ahead, the government enters into a standby agreement with the IMF for $2.6 billion. By May 2009, the government declares a military victory over the LTTE and a natural euphoria took over the island. This brings us to the third unstable block. Well, you see, Sri Lanka was now knee-deep in debt, but over 5 years, there was a major shift. Tax revenues, which should be growing and paying for public services in an economy that was growing as fast as Sri Lanka's was, were in sharp decline. From nearly 20% of GDP in 1990, tax had fallen to just 11% in 2010. This was a shortfall of billions of dollars. Remember how all that infrastructure was built on expectations that they would generate future earnings, particularly exports? Well, they didn't. Between 2005 and 2011, Sri Lanka's exports as a percentage of its economy decreased from 26% to 18%. The current account was also in deep deficit, reaching 7.8% in 2011. How did we finance this deficit? You guessed it, we needed to borrow more. By 2011, the need for reform was apparent to increase government revenues from taxation. When tax policy changes were implemented in 2011, they moved almost everything in the wrong direction. First, tax revenue was reduced as the tax rate reduced. Secondly, the tax base, meaning the group of people who are eligible to pay taxes, shrunk. Thirdly, tax policy was less progressive, meaning that at higher income levels, people paid less taxes as a proportion of their income, as major exemptions were given to the private sector. So why this policy, when it so obviously should have been the complete opposite? Well, it was because of politics. After a brutal end to a military conflict, where many civilians and military lost their lives, the government may have used this as a tool to solidify public support. So, there you have it, 3 unstable building blocks to set us up for Chapter 2. As you can tell by now, a lot had to go right and very little had to go wrong to push Sri Lanka over the edge. So far, we have told you the story of Sri Lanka's economy from the time of its first recorded history. That's over 2,600 years. If this timeline were to be compressed into a single year, we have now entered the last 36 hours. By 2011, Sri Lanka was in the final stages of the $2.5 billion IMF facility. Money was coming into the country, and it was going to fuel the biggest trade deficit of all time, of $1.1 billion. As foreign exchange was flowing out of Sri Lanka faster than it was flowing in, the central bank is concerned with the rupee getting weaker. Sri Lanka ran a fixed exchange rate system, but clearly the rupee was overvalued. So, the central bank did, and continued to make one of the most erroneous decisions to maintain the rupee at this fixed rate. It sells its own foreign reserves to buy the local currency by issuing bonds or treasury bills. This is what is called printing money. Now there are less rupees circulating in the system and the exchange rate is propped up. But less money in circulation could also choke natural demand, so the bank must immediately put money back into the system by buying rupee bonds or bills on the open market. This is called sterilization of the previous foreign currency sales. Useless? Many economists would agree. By 2012, the deficit had got so bad that the central bank allowed the currency to depreciate by 25% overnight. Prices of goods and services shot up. Inflation became persistent, and investors started reconsidering their projects, which had suddenly become more expensive than originally planned. Sri Lanka is now in a vicious cycle of debt. Through 2014, there is more borrowing to expand existing projects, begin new ones, and to repay old loans as they came due. And what about the infrastructure projects themselves? Some of them came at exorbitant costs. Studies from the World Bank and Oxford University on road construction concluded that Sri Lanka built some of the most expensive roads in the world. To make matters worse, several infrastructure contracts for roads had been awarded without competitive bidding. In 2014, their value went up to 333 billion rupees. Then, the UPFA was hit with a series of defections ahead of the 2015 presidential election. the most prominent of whom was Maithripala Sirisena, who announced his bid to contest in the presidential election under the United National Front for Good Governance, proposing to form a national government under Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe. The new government is voted in on the back of promises to rid the system of corruption. A series of activities took place under a 100-day program that promised major systemic changes, particularly to what is now perceived to be a crony, corrupt system. Immediately, in January 2015, to solidify their shaky position, they offered salary increases to the public sector and fuel price reductions for all. But very soon, there is a problem. On Friday, the 27th, several capital markets chat groups are lighting up. The central bank had just closed an auction of government bonds. Primary dealers who would buy this debt and go on to sell it had been notified that 1 billion rupees of government debt was for sale. But at the close of the auction, the amount accepted by the central bank is 10 billion rupees. There were more problems. The interest rate on the debt at the close of the auction was far more than what the bank had said it would be. The central bank had not advertised that it would be in for such a big business that day. The industry very quickly smelled a rat. Who was the beneficiary of all this business? It was a company called Perpetual Treasuries, whose major shareholder's father-in-law turned out to be Arjuna Mahendran, the newly appointed governor of the central bank and schoolmate of Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe. No one is going to let this go, and the scandal quickly cast a shadow on a government that had come in on an anti-corruption ticket. There is a growing rift between President Sirisena and Prime Minister Wickremesinghe, who appears to be defending the indefensible. This scandal damages investor confidence, and Sri Lanka's investment landscape gets riskier. Within a year, interest rates on government securities go up by 300 basis points. Charges are brought by the Attorney General against Perpetual Treasuries, stating that they had material undisclosed information of the central bank. Arrests are made. The gulf between President and Prime Minister grows larger. One of the key pivots the government introduced is to repeal the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution, voted on by Parliament on the 28th of April, takes away many presidential powers and restores a number of independent commissions. The government also decides to suspend major infrastructure projects like Colombo Port City and Chinese-funded infrastructure initiatives, disrupting investment flows into the island. By July 2016, pressure mounts on what is being termed as the bond scam, and a new central bank governor is appointed. He is Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy. Then, Minister of Finance Ravi Karunanayake brokers another IMF agreement, this time a 3-year extended fund facility for $1.5 billion, with a further amount of $650 million secured on the back of that. The IMF program is intense and expects serious reforms. That year's budget is painstakingly rewritten with IMF conditions weaved in, emphasizing better tax collection, reforming of state enterprises, rolling back trade protections, and a move to flexible interest and exchange rates. Not much is done to engage the public or prepare citizens and businesses for radical economic changes. Then, a piercing blow. Value-added tax, known as VAT, which is a tax on the sale of goods and services, was increased from 11% to 15%, and the threshold, or the revenue at which a business would be eligible to pay VAT, was also lowered. This is deeply unpopular and seen as targeting small businesses. There are widespread protests, no doubt fueled by a wounded opposition. The government is lurching from one big bungle to another. And then, of course, another crisis hits the government. At a July 2017 hearing of a Presidential Commission of Inquiry investigating the now infamous bond sale to Perpetual Treasuries in 2015, a key witness makes a startling revelation. They state that Minister Ravi Karunanayake, who now held the post of Minister of Foreign Affairs, had been occupying an apartment in Colombo paid for by the major shareholder of Perpetual Treasuries. The minister is summoned to testify before the commission and bemuses the entire country by stating that he has no idea how his rent was paid. By August 2017, public outcry causes him to resign. The new Minister of Finance, Mangala Samaravira, introduces the Inland Revenue Act, which is nothing short of revolutionary. His focus is simple: attract investors by simplifying the tax system and broadening the tax base. Two changes will indicate how serious they were. First was the introduction of the capital gains tax, which is a tax on the profit from the sale of property or investment. Also introduced was a prison term for tax evaders. All through this, resistance to these reforms is gaining momentum. Mounting scandals and unpopular changes start hitting people in their wallets. The tenuous partnership between President and Prime Minister is under pressure. Then, on October 26th, 2018, something happens, which may sound familiar. President Maithripala Sirisena dismisses Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe and appoints former President Mahinda Rajapaksa as Prime Minister instead. For the second time in his life, Prime Minister Wickremesinghe faces the prospect of being ousted. Wickremesinghe refuses to vacate his position, arguing that his dismissal is unconstitutional. The president, now enraged, dissolves parliament and calls for snap elections. For 51 days, Sri Lanka had two prime ministers until the Supreme Court intervenes, rules the dissolution unconstitutional, and both parliament and prime minister are reinstated. But the mess is now laid bare. A fractured government, a threadbare democracy, and the return of an influential, family-led political force. Then, in December, Sri Lanka's credit rating was downgraded. Management of the economy has come to a standstill, and bureaucracy, never efficient, was confused and slow. Growth is just 2.3% in 2018. And remember all those unpopular economic reforms and taxes? As we know by now, treats cost money. So Sri Lanka borrowed to fill the gap they couldn't meet with taxes. By 2018, government debt relative to the total output of the country has gone up from 74% to 90%, and international sovereign bonds on the balance sheet are valued at $10 billion. The promise of better, more equitable economic growth and good governance is starting to fade quickly into the rear view. Then, an unthinkable tragedy. On Easter Sunday, April 21st, 2019, a series of coordinated bomb attacks take place across Colombo and in the east of the island. The targets are churches and hotels. 269 people are killed and over 500 are injured. The attacks plunge Sri Lanka into darkness. Citizens are confused as a terror group financed by ISIS claims responsibility. Travel advisories are issued. There is mounting communal tensions directed against Sri Lanka's Muslim community. Then, within days, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, brother of former President Mahinda Rajapaksa, announces his candidacy for the presidential elections to be held that year. During his campaign, he promises two things: protection for the citizens and lower taxes. He won the election in November with 52% of the vote. The year is already teetering on the edge. Economic activity had slowed down after the Easter Sunday attack, and the government was funding state salaries at a higher base. The president announces his tax changes. Tax-free thresholds are raised, dropping the number of taxpayers by 1/3. VAT is lowered to 8% from 15%. Taxes at source are eliminated. The economy contracts by 0.2%. But that isn't even the problem anymore. Total collection of revenue is halved. The government is in debt to the tune of 1 trillion rupees and runs a deficit of nearly 7%. Economists ring the alarm bells. The equation will not balance, and now it will only take one tiny thing to push Sri Lanka over the edge. His secretary, P.B. Jayasundara, goes on to say, the president knew the revenue will be lost, but he considers the lost revenue as an investment in the country. Then it happens in March 2020, COVID-19. Borders are closed, economic activity shutters, curfew is imposed. The country comes to a standstill among widespread fear of the pandemic. By April, Sri Lanka's sovereign credit rating is downgraded again. The reason? Unsustainable debt. Sri Lanka's multi-billion-dollar tourism earnings crash. Now it is only a matter of time. The IMF advises an immediate stop to the printing of money and instead calls for a series of tough measures to tighten budgets, like cutting government spending. Instead, to make salary payments, the central bank ramps up the money printing at an unprecedented rate. The IMF cautions that continuing this course would cause an economic collapse. The economy contracts by 3.5% that year. By 2021, Sri Lanka had expensive debt repayments due on international sovereign bonds issued all those years before, and these accounted for 70% of the country's interest payments. And more borrowing is not possible. Remember, Sri Lanka's credit has been downgraded. In April 2021, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, under the impression that it will save the country's foreign exchange, totally bans the use of chemical fertilizers and chemicals used in agriculture. The reasons are unclear. Though at a time of pandemic-induced food shortages, many question the logic of the decision. There is widespread panic among farmers and agriculturalists. Within a year, rice and tea production is down by nearly 50%. By September, prices start climbing. Sri Lankans who had already been depleted and diminished by COVID-19 now face the prospect of rampant inflation, starting to hit double digits. The government declares an economic emergency. As the country closes 2021, the rupee lost 8% of its value, and inflation was starting its upward climb to 11%. Even worse, with much better rates being offered by informal money exchange dealers, workers are now not using banks at all to remit money. The economy contracts by 4.6%, and the nation's finances are ready to implode. An urgent call is made in January 2022 from the President's office to the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, who makes the trip to Colombo. The subject: urgent relief from debt owed to China, given the country's cash crunch. Usable reserves are just $2 billion. That January is grim. Secretary to the President, P.B. Jayasundara, resigns. There is a $500 million sovereign debt repayment due that month. And fearing an imminent collapse, to preserve what little foreign exchange was left, economists urged the government to preemptively default and start discussions to restructure the dues. Until the very last day, Governor Cabral is nonchalant. He sticks to a well-worn script that Sri Lanka always pays its debts and that it can find a homegrown solution to what the government insists is temporary illiquidity. And then, to everyone's bewilderment, the payment is made on January 18th. By March, the crisis is at everyone's doorsteps. Many goods are banned from import and a punishing schedule of power cuts are announced. Usable foreign reserves are now $1.9 billion, well short of the $5 billion needed to service debt that year. Sri Lanka needs $500 to $700 million a month on fuel. Without the funds to pay for these, there are major shortages. Unable to get their hands on cooking gas, nearly 1,000 bakeries shutter their shops. Power cuts are daily and up to 12 hours long. School children are affected, first without good enough access to online materials or devices, and now studying by candlelight. Queues form and snake everywhere on the island, around petrol stations, gas queues, and food distribution centers. Some of these span weeks. But more importantly, around passport offices and foreign embassies, those who can start fleeing the country en masse. During this time, 13 people die waiting in queues. Newspapers stop printing daily. As the humanitarian crisis worsens, a massive civilian movement is gathering from all over the island, never leaving the site of the Presidential Secretariat in Colombo. In March, the rupee is released from the prison of its dollar peg and immediately depreciates by 80%. By the 3rd of April, a number of cabinet ministers resign from their posts, unable to face the heat. The President and Prime Minister Rajapaksa are now isolated. Governor Nivad Cabral resigns on the 4th. Minister Ali Sabri is appointed Finance Minister and resigns a day later. There are now open calls for the resignation of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, even from his own allies. To be able to survive, on a single day in April, nearly 120 billion rupees was printed. A quiet voice of reason starts cutting through the chaos. Central Bank Governor Nandalal Veerasinghe, in his first session, takes policy rates up by 700 basis points. He refers to Sri Lanka as a car about to careen off a cliff and that they must apply the brakes. But it is not enough. Then on the 10th of April, the country's medical professionals and pharmaceutical industry issues a dire warning of shortages of life-saving medicines on the island due to huge, uncleared credit backlogs to suppliers. And then, it finally happens. On the 12th of April, the Sri Lankan government makes the announcement that almost everyone knew was coming. For the first time in its history, Sri Lanka would default on its external debt obligations, currently outstanding at a staggering $51 billion. The rest of the month was a chilling escalation of violence and protests, as calls from every corner of the island grew for the president to resign. The citizens' movement is called the Aragalaya, meaning struggle, a word that will be etched in Sri Lankans' memories forever. Then on the 9th of May, government supporters start attacking the citizens' movement. This causes an unprecedented escalation. The world is watching as government buildings are stormed. Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa resigns. A few days later, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa shocks the nation by announcing the appointment of Ranil Wickremesinghe to replace his brother. Major international agencies are now issuing warnings that Sri Lanka's humanitarian crisis is untenable and food scarcity is starting to grip the island's citizens. The country is brought to its knees. After a dramatic few days, President Rajapaksa leaves the country and tenders his resignation. In a parliamentary election, Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe is made president. There have been months of pain, anxiety and frustration for the citizens of the country. Then, the all-important news. Sri Lanka would seek IMF assistance, a gargantuan effort at a time when Sri Lanka had declared bankruptcy. There were friends who helped. India's timely intervention, headed by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, provides $4 billion of aid in the first half of 2022 alone. Sri Lanka had by now lost so much credibility in international markets that it would have found several doors difficult to open. India went the extra mile and stood shoulder to shoulder with Sri Lanka, pledging to collaborate to reorganize its finances. Bangladesh, which several years before was one of the poorest countries in Asia, extends a $200 million currency swap. What few know is that at its lowest point, Sri Lanka's treasury only had $25 million in foreign currency. Not enough even for the full day. Sri Lankans will never forget the images of that year, of millions on the streets of Colombo screaming hoarsely for change. But we will also remember other images. Families coordinating so that they could hold places in queues that lasted weeks. Children taking their exams in dilapidated schoolhouses with umbrellas for protection. Of people collapsing with hunger. Of desperate faces waiting in front of passport offices. We tell this story for all of them. For all of us. The economy contracted by nearly 8% that year, and prices rose by 50%. The proportion of people in poverty doubled sharply to 25%. Families and workers continue to emigrate as they struggle to find a place to prosper or even survive. In November 2023, a 5-judge bench of the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka made an unprecedented judgment. In it, they held that former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, former Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, former Finance Minister Basil Rajapaksa, former governors of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Professor W.D. Lakshman and Ajit Niwad Cabral, former Secretary to the Treasury S.R. Artigala, former Monetary Board and former Secretary to the President Dr. P.B. Jayasundara, had violated the public trust and breached Article 12 of the Constitution in their administration of the economy, leading to the country's economic crisis. The IMF approved $3 billion of funding under an extended fund facility. The immediate focus of the program was to restore stability to the economy and make Sri Lanka's debt sustainable. The long-term objective is to support Sri Lanka's growth through reforms. At the end of the report, the IMF concluded that it recognized that a major reason the country did not progress was because it did not implement timely reforms or learn from other countries in similar crises which recovered. At the time of broadcast, Sri Lanka had reached a deal with most of its bilateral lenders, India, China and Japan, but agreement is yet to be reached with private lenders. Sri Lanka is expected to be in default until the year 2027. Thank you for watching the story of Sri Lanka's economic history on Patta History, made possible by support and commitment of a dedicated team and the support of many. This is a story of misfortune, yes, but it is also a story of reckless mismanagement. It is a story of a country where economic choices were almost always based on politics and not pragmatism. As Sri Lankans, we live in eternal hope to heal, to grow, but most importantly, to never make these same mistakes again.